Margaret sat in a meadow, alone while the evening sun said its long crimson goodbye, recalling the day she married William. The day she nearly died of happiness, she thought. That had been only 6 months ago, before the war snatched her husband away. The redcoats came through their village, taking all the strong young men, and when they left, the town grew quiet, the hearths cold, and Margaret was left as forlorn as blooms wilted and faded in a long-forgotten vase. Her William, was gone. Stolen, she reckoned. She had kissed him goodbye then, on the cottage threshold, her hands clutching at his, as if she could hold him there by sheer will. But the army he would not defy. No, he had too much honor for that. But he had knelt then and promised to return. She brushed away the tears, then, and managed a smile that pricked deeply at her own heart. At first, she drowned in loneliness, as the days stretched long and mute, and the nights deaf to her weeping, until one morning she went walking in the woods behind their cottage, following the narrow path they had once walked together. It was there she found the first feather. It was small and white, caught in the brambles, as though left just for her. She plucked it free and held it close. A sign, she thought, proof that he was still alive. That very night she placed the feather in a small wooden box beside their bed, whispering his name like a prayer. The next morning, she found another, a brown, speckled one, resting in the grass. And the day after that, a glossy, black one, gleaming like polished shoes. Every day, without fail, a new feather appeared on her path. She collected them all, placing them carefully in her box. With each one, she felt William's presence, as though the feathers were carrying his breath back to her from across the channel. Summer turned to autumn, and still, William did not return. The village had begun to whisper of the war's toll, of men lost in battles across the sea, of letters arriving bearing only sorrow. Margaret saw the tears on the faces of the weeping wives and mothers of the slain soldiers, and judged them weak in comparison to her own tears of loneliness. No one's love was as deep as hers. Besides, she had her feathers. They would keep her William safe and bring him home. But when would he return to her? Why didn't she sense that too? She wondered. One evening, as she sat gazing into the light of a fat candle, an urge came over her. As if mesmerized by its glow, she gathered all of her candles and melted them down, mixing the wax until it was pliable in her hands. Slowly, she shaped the softened wax, molding it into the form of a bird, its beak sharp, its wings poised for flight. Then she retrieved her box of feathers, and one by one, she pressed them into its body, whispering her husband's name each time. William, William, William. When she was finished, the bird sat in her palms, fragile, waiting, hopeful. At dawn, she carried it to the meadow, where she and William had once lain in the tall grass, watching the clouds shift above them. She knelt and held the bird to her chest, murmuring a prayer for William's safe return. Then, with trembling hands, she cast it into the air. The bird did not fall, but hovered there for a moment above her. It fluttered, shuddering in the morning light, and then, before her eyes, it was no longer wax. It was flesh and bone and feather, alive and whole. With a single caw, it soared into the sky and was gone. Margaret was overjoyed. She returned home, her heart light as the morning breeze. She cooked a meal and set the table. She took down William's favorite cup and sang a merry tune and laughed, then went to sit out on the front steps to wait. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and rose, She saw him, a figure standing by the gate. William! She ran to him, her breath catching on his name. His uniform was ragged, his boots caked in mud. But it was him. His face, his hands, his eyes. She threw herself into his arms, weeping with joy, holding him as tightly as she had the day he left. But his arms just hung there. They did not embrace her back. She pulled away, searching his face. His eyes, that once saw her deeply, were glazed and unblinking. His lips that had once thrilled her to heaven, stiff and mute. His passionate voice speaking poetry, how every day, every hour, every minute away from her was worse than the bullets he had faced. Never came. She touched his cheek. Cold, clammy. When she whispered his name again, he only stared, his head tilting ever so slightly, like a bird uncertain of its perch. Margaret led him inside, guiding him to the fire, to the chair where he had once sat, reading by candlelight. He sat obediently, his hands limp in his lap. He did not speak. He did not move unless she moved him. When she took his hand, it was stiff beneath her fingers. His skin, she realized with horror, was not the warm flesh she had once known. But it did feel familiar. It felt like the melted wax of her candles. It made her shudder, and she fell to her knees before him, her hands shaking. "William," she begged, "please." But his lips did not move. His breath did not stir. He was there, but not. Then slowly his head turned toward the window. Not like a man, but like something else. A stiff, unnatural motion that sent a faint, cracking sound through the silence. A thin fracture ran down his cheek that glinted faintly in the firelight. His eyes, unblinking, fixed on something. She turned to see what it was. Then on the windowsill a bird landed. She glanced up at it through tears now welling up in her eyes. She saw that it had all the feathers she had found. It was her bird. It cocked its head and spoke, "It is I, your William." Then it flapped its wings and flew away.